My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Last episode, I looked at the very beginnings of Chinese literature. This episode, we're going to fast forward to one of the most recent works of Chinese literature. Well, maybe not all that recent. Today, we'll look at a novel that was written in 1986, 1987. Wow, that's almost as old as me. It's quite famous because it's by Mo Yan, and it was one of the things I believe highlighted in the Nobel Prize that he won in 2012. So in a certain way, it's fairly recent, if you count that. The novel I'm talking about, of course, is Hong Gao Liang. In English, it's just called Red Sorghum. This is, I would say, the most famous novel by Mo Yan. So first, a bit about Mo Yan himself. So his real name, Mo Yan is just his pen name. His real name is Guan Mo Ye. Mo Yan literally means don't speak. I'm sure all of y'all know this, but that pen name was inspired, of course, by the Gwen Stefani song, Don't Speak. Don't speak, I know just what you're saying, so please stop explaining. Don't tell me 'cause it... Okay, I'll stop. That was a joke in two ways. First off, my singing is, I guess you could call it a joke. It's more like a catastrophe. Second, Mo Yan was not inspired at all by Gwen Stefani. But there is another joke if you look at Mo Yan's name. His real name is Guan Mo Ye, and his pen name is Mo Yan. If you look at the Mo in his real name, it actually is just the Mo of Mo Yan, with the addition of the radical for speech or writing. That one character actually, in a kind of joking way, references his real name. So if you broke the two pieces, the two main parts of the Mo in his real name in half, it would make Yan Mo or something like that. So that, I think, is part of the reason his pen name is Mo Yan. It's just actually a reference to his real name. So that's another joke in addition to the meaning of the name, which is don't speak. A brief introduction about Mo Yan. So Mo Yan was born in 1955 in Gaomi County. That's a little tiny rural area northeast of Qingdao, the famous old German colony. The region is known for growing, you guessed it, red sorghum. It's also known for being the kind of Chinese heartland. It's very rural. And this is one of the main places where much of Mo Yan's stories are set. Speaking of stories, let's jump into Red Sorghum. It's really hard to talk about a plot in this novel. It's a very complicated and convoluted novel. That's another way of saying there's not much of a plot. I'm being a bit glib there. It would probably be better to say that this is a postmodern novel that rejects a linear plot. So you have all of these different scenes being thrown at you, different narrators, different time periods are being narrated. Those oftentimes are not marked in the text. So you'll go from narrating something that happened in the 1920s to something that happened in the 1940s and then back to the 1920s. The author never really sets out when it is. You just have to figure out on your own based on what's happening and who's alive, who's dead. You have a narrator narrating things that happened through an eyewitness account based on things that happened before he was born. So it's just this very kind of trippy effect that you have when you're reading this. The main narrator largely narrates things that happened to his great-grandfather, his grandfather, and his father. It's not exactly clear in the novel how the narrator knows what happened. It's kind of, to me, it felt like this burden of history is kind of bearing down on the narrator, and he's looking back at the greatness of these three male figures in his life. Maybe he heard these things as stories when he was young, or because it's a postmodern novel, it doesn't really matter. It's an interesting question that the text leaves you with, but never really provides an answer. Beyond that, there are some things that he narrates there's no possible way he could have known about just through any kind of thing based in reality. So as his grandmother is dying, we get her internal monologue of her apologizing to the gods. I guess apologizing about refusing to sleep with her leper husband and taking a lover, that is the narrator's great-grandfather. There's so much to unpack about this novel. I set out to talk about plot, but instead I'm talking about postmodernity and narration and these kind of issues that I don't know if you as a listener really care about. But that's me as a literature nerd. In summation, I guess I would say it's necessary to understand that this plot is not a traditional plot, and you just kind of have to piece it together. But now, let me get to the actual plot. There are several stories going on. First, the narrator's grandmother is married off to a rich guy who owns a sorghum distillery, but he is ugly and mean, and he's infected with leprosy. Eventually, the narrator's grandfather kills this owner of the sorghum distillery and marries the grandmother and takes over the distillery. Second, the plot focuses on a period of about 2 decades where the grandfather, the grandmother are waging a guerrilla war against the Japanese who have invaded China. In his novel, Red Sorghum, Mo Yan plays on that reputation of being the Chinese heartland. He presents this village, Gaomi, and the struggles of one family, mostly from the 1920s to the 1940s, but occasionally bumping in and out. In a way, Red Sorghum and this Gaomi village become symbols of the Chinese people writ large. In the same way that in the US, you have a lot of literature where people talk about the heartland in Iowa or wherever, and the space represents quote-unquote real America. Mo Yan is charting out the course of this one family through the period of political chaos and warfare as a story that represents the quote-unquote real China. And the crop that most represents the Chinese people is red sorghum. Just so that you have an idea of what's going on and it's not just me blabbering, I'm going to read a little bit from the English translation. The translation I used was the main one. It's by Howard Goldblatt. He is the guy who does Mo Yan's translations. He's probably the most famous translator of Chinese literature into English. This is a passage when a Japanese soldier on horseback is trying to push his way through the sorghum, and you kind of can see the symbolism. The charging horse turned with difficulty and headed back, stalks of sorghum struggling bitterly against its rump, some bending and some breaking, others snapping back into place. They shivered in the autumn winds like victims of malaria. Father saw the flared nostrils and fleshy lips of the panting warhorse. Bloody froth sprayed from between gleaming white teeth and dripped from its greedy lower lip. Clouds of white dust from the agitated sorghum stung its watery eyes. So this is not really hard to unpack. I mean, the sorghum is there, it's getting knocked about, but it's also resisting the Japanese soldier on horseback. Eventually, some of the sorghum stalks will break, but most of them will still be there, and they're so numerous that the soldier on horseback can't really win in a battle with this so numerous sorghum. And that symbolism, that sorghum represents the Chinese people, is part of a broader message, I would say, in this novel. Throughout all this violence and political change that we see in this novel, and this novel is really freaking violent. The novelist narrates a man getting cut apart and tortured. It can be quite gruesome at times, but throughout all of this violence and political change, the Chinese people abide. That's kind of what I read as one of the main messages in this novel. It's that the Chinese people are so numerous that they are going to last through all of this violence, through all of this destruction. They are going to survive. Even when some of them are trampled upon, most of them will keep on living. There are just too many of them to be extinguished. And, he's writing about a period in the 1940s, mostly, and 1920s, where there were people seriously contemplating whether or not China as a nation, as a culture, would survive. And he's writing in the 80s. This is after Mao's Cultural Revolution, after the Great Leap Forward, where you had such a massive amount of death, starvation, and destruction. And so these questions are at the forefront of Mo Yan's mind, and they're at the forefront, I think, of this novel. It's a weird celebration of the Chinese people because there's so much violence, there's so much killing, just so many Chinese people die, including the narrator's family oftentimes. It feels to me like Mo Yan's message is, oh sure, there is this violence against the Chinese people, but it really doesn't matter. There are just too many of us to kill completely. And that's, as horrible as that sounds, that's meant to be a kind of celebratory message. So this is a fascinating novel in terms of the politics. Mo Yan is about as mainstream as you can get in Chinese writing. He's a member of the government-sponsored Chinese Writers Association. Again, we're in a communist society, and a lot of my friends, when I say I went to China, they think of it as kind of a capitalist society that still pretends to be communist or something like that. But there are still a lot of vestiges of traditional socialist Leninist thinking. And one of those is that the government actually gives a salary to writers. It gets to choose who is the writers, but it does give them a salary. Mo Yan he became the chairman of the Chinese Writers Association in November of 2011, just before he got the Nobel Prize. This novel is published as a serial novel in one of the magazines run by the People's Liberation Army, the PLA. I believe at the time this novel is published, I haven't been able to confirm this, but based off the evidence that I've read, I believe this is true. Mo Yan is actually still getting his salary not directly from the government, but actually from the army. He's a PLA writer. He's a writer who's employed at this time by the People's Liberation Army. Lots of commentators in the West talking about Mo Yan have said Mo Yan did not deserve the Nobel Prize because he hasn't done enough to speak out against the CCP, because he's not a dissident writer. Because of this fact, he does not deserve to be recognized by the Nobel Committee. I struggle with this argument. It seems weird to me. So the criticism is that you're only a good Chinese writer if you are a dissident writer writing against the government? I just don't buy it. It seems overly political as an argument. I don't want to get into the politics of it. Just this argument that a lot of people had in 2012 about whether or not Mo Yan deserved the Nobel Prize because of his position in these official circles in the Chinese government. It struck me as really weird and kind of uninformed. So first off, Mo Yan is highly critical of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. He just does it from within the party. This novel is interesting because he's writing it in the 1980s, 10, 20 years before. If you were writing a novel, you had to focus on the Chinese Communist Party, especially a World War II novel. You had to write about the glories of the revolution, the glories of the war against Japan. That was the required narrative that you had to present. And so for Mo Yan, just 10 years after the 改革开放, the opening up of China economically and to a certain degree politically, to be writing a novel that is talking about guerrilla warfare against the Japanese and doesn't even really have a role for the Chinese Communist Party to play, it's actually something that is quite political. I know that if you're not attuned to the way that World War II is represented in mainland China, that may seem like, so what? He didn't talk about the CCP. But for the CCP, for much of its history, it required that literature talking about World War II be framed in a way that centers the Chinese Communist Party and its role in the fight against the Japanese. This novel, it ducks that. It can do that because it's coming out in the 1980s. Still, to do that in a literary magazine owned by the PLA, first off, it's actually a highly critical move. It's easy to miss this, but this novel being published in the 1980s would, I think most readers would have recognized what he is doing as quote-unquote politically incorrect. And I'm using that term politically incorrect, not in the sense that oftentimes folks in America use it, but in the Chinese sense of that term. That is, it would have been a move that the CCP judged as not correct politically. Another thing about this novel that I find fairly critical of official communist narratives is that there are sometimes where Mo Yan is clearly making fun of the glorious histories that are constructed in official communist narratives. Sometimes he goes, that's all nonsense. So there is a chapter that is absolutely hilarious. This chapter is called Dog Ways. It actually gives several tens of pages of narratives that focus just on the military maneuvers of the dog armies as they're scavenging over the bodies of the Chinese humans killed by Japanese military officials. I kid you not, later on in the novel, we get the perspective of the dog. And these dogs are described as having two armies. They're fighting both each other, that is the dogs, and the narrator's family, that is the humans, over the flesh of the human dead. Much though not all of this part of the story is told from the dog's perspective. It's a very, very trippy narrative. You just kind of have to read it to get it. But it's also interesting because it's questioning the CCP's line on history. In narrating the history of these fights against the Japanese, In terms of dogs looking for human flesh, it calls into question the glorious narratives that the CCP offers on history. If for the CCP, history is inevitably going to result in the glorious victory of the Communist Party, for Mo Yan, he's undercutting that by claiming that history has nothing to do with human glory. He juxtaposes dog history with human history, dog bodies with human bodies. Implicitly, he asks, what's the difference between these two, human history and dog history? Human bodies and dog bodies. Why is one worth more than the others? Why is one more valuable than the others? In the end, his message seems to be, there is no glory in history. It's just stuff that happened. That's all history is. There is no glory in history. So those are 3 reasons why I find this criticism of Mo Yan to be off base. First off, a Chinese writer doesn't have to be a dissident writer to be a good writer. Second, Mo Yan he's not a dissident writer, but he actually is highly critical of the political and social context in a way that we would expect from any great writer. These are just 2 examples of how this novel is highly critical of depictions of history. Okay, I think I've banged on enough about this novel. Just before we go, I'm going to give you a Chengyu that is related, sort of, inspired by the dog ways chapter of Mo Yan's Red Sorghum. 斗鸡走狗. So it literally means to enjoy cockfights and dog racing. And it is from the Shiji, the earliest real history text that we have in Chinese literature by Sima Qian. And it kind of refers to things that rich guys do, generally being idle and enjoying those kinds of things. So that's it for this episode. I'm going to go off and 斗鸡走狗. Until next time, my name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.